I give the floor to the representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to speak first of the Security Council and to the subsidiary bodies and to convey very good news. The Syrian Arab army has liberated the city of Ma'ared an-Nu'man, which is on the road between Idlib and Aleppo. Of course, the liberation of this historic city is of utmost importance. After we've eradicated terrorism, after we freed Ma'ared an-Nu'man of terrorism, we need to liberate Sarakib and Ariha. Only then would we be able to reopen the airport of Aleppo. And that's the crux of the matter. Reopening the airport of Aleppo means that we no longer need cross-border aid operations. Especially through Gaziantep, the intelligence center, Gaziantep. We worked with our allies to liberate this area. This, of course, goes against anyone who would like to continue cross-border aid operations. Reopening Aleppo Airport means we no longer need cross-border aid operations. From what I understood from your statements, you do not want us to reopen the Aleppo airport so that you can continue to interfere in our domestic affairs through cross-border aid operations. Mr. President, as usual, we've listened to Secretariat officials and delegates, and they delivered identical statements on the suffering of Syrian people in the Syrian crisis. Some presented fabricated figures and played around with them. Some spoke of 3 or 4 million civilians in Idlib. The accurate figure is 800,000 civilians in Idlib, plus 90,000 terrorism, plus their families. We get 300,000. So we have overall 1,300,000 civilians and terrorists and their families. And some said there are approximately 3 million in the northeast of Syria, and thousands in a Rokban camp and other thousands in Al-Hol camp. However, over the past 9 years, none of them, not even the Undersecretary General, spoke of the suffering and the hard living conditions of Syrians inside and outside of Syria as a result of terrorism with its various names, as a result of occupation by various occupying powers, as a result of aggression with its various forms, and as a result of unilateral, coercive economic measures imposed by various countries. I would like to thank my friend, the Chinese ambassador, for addressing this highly important matter. What I would like to focus on today, as we are committed to conveying to you the concerns of the Syrian people, is a form of terrorism that is complementary to armed terrorism of terrorist organizations designated by the Security Council and associated entities, namely economic terrorism and the policies of collective punishment applied by governments of member states to dissuade us from making our own choices, to have our own national positions. This is inconsistent with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. It is inconsistent with the principle of sovereign equality. It is inconsistent with all human rights instruments and the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. The tune that Western countries are playing day and night, claiming that they want to empower countries and they want to ensure that no one is left behind. That is what they're saying. I'm just repeating what they're saying. Don't kill the messenger. It seems that they interpret this phrase as eliminating others, treating them unjustly so that they can move on and so that there is no one left, period. Mr. President, today all Syrians, meaning 24 million Syrians, are suffering. Not 1, not 2, not 10 million, 24 million Syrians are suffering from a wide array of coercive measures that affect their daily lives. OCHA is shamefully ignoring our repeated appeals to accord the issue the importance that it deserves, in the reports at least, in OCHA reports. What is even more shameful are the responses that we get from OCHA representatives in closed consultations with them. They say they're not allowed to speak of this matter, otherwise their career would be affected, or they might be punished or even sacked. This excuse is worse than the crime, especially coming from people who are supposed to be carrying out a noble humanitarian mission in an impartial and professional way. OCHA presented 64 written reports and hundreds of briefings, not a single reference to Syrian children suffering from the bitter cold in schools and hospitals and homes without heating as a result of coercive measures that prevent us from importing fuel to compensate for our oil and gas that we lost to the American occupier who's so very proudly stealing our oil and gas. Americans claim that they love Syrian oil and gas. Today, we heard the American ambassador. It asked the Syrian government and Russia to deliver aid to Arukban. This is what we heard of the American ambassador. The United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, is occupying the 10th area in Syria. In this area, it is protecting and arming a terrorist group called Maghawir al-Sawra. This group attacked Al-Suwaida in the south 2 years ago and massacred hundreds of civilians at 4 a.m. Men, women, and children. They were massacred at 4 a.m. This terrorist group that attacked Al-Suwaida and massacred hundreds of civilians and kidnapped dozens of women and children is sponsored by the USA in the Al-10th area that it occupies. Nevertheless, my American colleague is asking us and our allies, to allow for the delivery of humanitarian aid to Al-Rukban and Al-10th area, meaning that the Americans are occupying our territory, they're sponsoring a terrorist organization on our territory, and then they're asking us to deliver humanitarian aid to those areas. As if, as a major power, they've never heard of something called the responsibility of an occupying power. According to the international humanitarian aid, the occupying power is supposed to deliver humanitarian aid to civilians living in the area under occupation. Anyway, dozens of reports and hundreds of briefings, and OCHA has not reported on the newborns who've lost their lives as a result of power cuts in incubators in health centers and hospitals. It hasn't reported on other newborns who survived. However, coercive measures killed them, after all, through preventing them from receiving children's milk and other basic nutrients. OCHA hasn't reported on mothers that are educating their children by the light of a candle. Dozens of reports and hundreds of briefings, and OCHA has not reported on those who've lost their lives in operation rooms because of a ban on importing surgical threads and anti-clotting medication used during surgeries. ban to import basic medical equipment such as MRI machines and X-ray machines. Nevertheless, Mr. Lowcock today deemed that the closure of Al Arabiya crossing, that is controlled by the USA, by the way, is what prevents us from importing surgical threads. He spoke of 400 different types of drugs and supplies, including surgical threads. So there is no other crossing that can be used to import surgical threads except Al Arabiya, isn't it? Isn't it so? Only Al Arabiya. Only through Al Arabiya we're able to import surgical threads. It's as if this crossing is kind of specialized in importing surgical threads. These are the lies that we've listened to today. Dozens of reports and hundreds of briefings, and OCHA hasn't spoke of those with special needs that are affected by coercive measures. They weren't able to receive artificial limbs or electric wheelchairs. Dozens of reports and hundreds of briefings, and OCHA hasn't reported on Syrians being unable to import basic needs such as food and medication as a result of sanctions imposed on the banking sectors, which makes it impossible to make any financial transactions. OCHA hasn't reported on the situation of Syrians abroad, not able to receive any consular services in a number of countries, unable to transfer even a small amount of money to help their families in Syria. OCHA hasn't reported on the fate of tens of thousands of Syrians who drowned in the Mediterranean at the hands of Turkish smuggling gangs and people traffickers. Mr. President, 9 years have passed. Not once did we hear OCHA asking Germany, for instance, to allow Siemens, a German company, to supply necessary spare parts for the electricity generating plant in Gendar that was built by Germany decades ago. This is a purely humanitarian matter, a basic need for hospitals, schools, and Syrian civilians. So what is the point of those reports and those meetings if they're unable to provide spare parts for an electricity generating plant? Hasn't OCHA listened to the complaints of UN offices and international organizations operating in Syria, complaining of the effects of coercive measures on its humanitarian operations? Hasn't it reviewed ESCWA reports confirming the significant adverse effects of coercive measures on the humanitarian deliveries in Syria? Hasn't OCHA heard what Mr. Idris al-Jazairi has said, the special rapporteur on the adverse effects of coercive unilateral measures on the enjoyment of human rights? I quote, he said, "Those coercive unilateral measures contribute to the exacerbation of the suffering of the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people. It is hard to believe that they're there to protect Syrians." End of quote. Shouldn't OCHA take its head out of the sand and describe things as they are? Mr. President, we are now talking about the humanitarian situation in Syria. I presented all that as the reports of OCHA must be commensurate with the noble mission of OCHA. However, since it's not the case, we remember a saying, you cannot run around fire and expect not to sweat. So whoever makes mistakes must bear the consequences. Mr. President, there are many effects of coercive measures that OCHA has not reported on. Some in this council might deem them secondary matters, merely collateral damage, as it's called by the liars, collateral damage. What a lovely phrase. However, these are matters that are affecting the Syrian people and are thus a top priority for us and for anybody that respects the principles of international law and international humanitarian law. And I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that we don't have any problem with OCHA as an institution. We have a problem with those working in OCHA who replaced UN humanitarian agendas to the agenda of the arguments whose nationalities they hold. If they were honest, they wouldn't have refrained from responding to our calls. They wouldn't have refrained from providing support to 40 towns and cities that were liberated from from terrorism in Idlib and its surrounding areas. Hundreds of towns were liberated from terrorism, but OCHA has never provided humanitarian aid to those. In conclusion, Mr. President, my country stresses that we will build on the great achievements we have made in cooperation with a number of UN agencies, the ICRC, and 38 non-governmental organizations authorized to work in Syria. Among them, 5 French organizations, 3 American organizations, 5 British organizations, 4 German organizations, 3 Russian organizations, and other from Denmark, Norway, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Austria, and Finland. We stress it is of utmost importance to lift coercive measures without any conditions and immediately, and to end once and for all the policies of collective punishment adopted by governments of some member states, as this is inconsistent with international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international law. And I reassure you that despite the pressure on the Syrian people, we will not give up our sovereignty, and we will not allow anyone to prevent us from making our national choices. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Syrian Arab Republic for his statement.